Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brett Provenzano. I am the proud superintendent of the Fairport Central School District. Proud to be sharing this evening with you here tonight. We're here to hear a very special presentation from Shane Wiegand and Gabrielle Brannigan. The name of their presentation is Racist Policy and Resistance in Rochester and Fairport. I have the honor to frame the conversation tonight and to get us started. We are here tonight to learn about our local history. Rochester is an amazing place. Fairport's an amazing place, but there is history to understand. Educating all of our students and staff on this history will help us all learn together and become better for each other and for our local and greater community. The idea of brotherhood, sisterhood, and embracing all of humanity is not new ideas to our schools here in Fairport. Brotherhood, Sisterhood Week is upon us. We are celebrating our 25th years. That is it, 25 years of paying homage to the enduring themes of care. They are at the core of who we are as a school community. That is, in this district, we strive to show civility toward each other. Again, 25 years of this conversation. Awareness to our surroundings. Respect for everyone and embrace the wonderful differences among us all. Together, we are all stronger and better for each other. I'm finishing my 16th year here in Fairport. It's my 6th year as superintendent. Before I was superintendent, I was fortunate to be at district office for 1 year as a central office administrator, and then spent close to 10 years at Joanna Perrin as principal. It does not take much to realize that today we are living in bitter and highly polarizing times. One could take to social media or even the many different news outlets to confirm this. And where one could see others finding themselves at odds with their neighbors, and sometimes in such bitter fashions too. The causes are real, and what is at stake is crucial for our students and the world in which we are sending them into. We see it everywhere: war, injustice, racial tension, racism, poverty, ecology issues, immigration, the economy, health discrepancies, democratic principles, law and order, civil unrest. These are pervasive threads that are inundating our students' lives. All of these are real life and emotionally charged issues that our students come to school with today and grapple with, and they will have to continue to grapple with these ideas. For if we're to become better and continue to move through the list that I just mentioned, we need to prepare our students for not only today, but well into the future. Schools are microcosms of society, and we are certainly not impervious to societal issues. We are compelled to ensure that our students are equipped to be critical thinkers and make informed decisions so they can affect and positively influence our world and humanity. We want to make sure that all of our students have the opportunity to do this equitably with access to high-quality program, and so that our care principles are realized and the investment that we provide in our schools are maximized so our children can have the very best. That's our goal. Our goal is to build lasting and sustainable conversations around this topic of cultural awareness and competency, and developing a deep sense of understanding so we can be sure that our students are equipped to move forward in the future. And again, this is not a new conversation. My 6th year in the district, and there is this Board of Education Statement of Core Beliefs. It's been here since 2014, where the Board of Education explicitly states that the Fairport education, the true measure of Fairport education, is taking civic responsibility, being caring, respectful individuals, and becoming healthy contributors with a lifelong desire to learn. Our students have been and will continue to be prepared for their next phase in life because of our commitment to the whole child. Again, in my 6th year, we continue to refine our district goals, vision statement, and mission statement. In these documents, you'll see important concepts of diversity, equitable access, and diverse outcomes for each and every student. We expect students to be critical thinkers and participate and contribute in a diverse society. Again, in the mission statement, words like access and equity, diversity continues to ring through these core documents, and the importance of being engaged in and contributing to a global community. These are at the core of who we are. So over the past year, it wasn't a surprise when we wanted to add a layer of credibility to the work that we've been working on for the past 25 years and more in this district. It's naturally embedded in our DNA. The community engaged in an equity audit. 2,500 students participated. We had close to 1,200 staff, parent, and community responses. There's a diversity council that has Board of Education, community member, past students, educators, and teachers who helped form these big rocks: curriculum and instruction, recruiting and hiring, parent and community and student involvement, data and policies, and professional learning. Tonight, we're focusing in on professional learning because we have educators out there listening to this presentation. We have community engagement also at the core of this conversation tonight. And we're going to be talking a little bit about curriculum and instruction as we move through this evening. And we hope that we're able to touch base on these as the presentation continues. What's more, this past June, Monroe County superintendents pledged to stand together against racism. And we all agreed, and this is happening in all 22 component districts, to assess our policies and practices, engage in meaningful professional development on culturally responsive practices, participate in a regional equity network where we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, partner with BOCES and the University of Rochester Center for Urban Success to develop common units of study. And we'll be talking a little bit about those tonight and how that's translating in our Fairport schools. Continue to listen to the voices of our families and students of color, because there's a story that needs to continue to be processed. We need to be open to these conversations and engage in student-led activities so we can always learn and grow together as a community. Tonight, there's comments and questions that you have. If you have more comments and questions, we've been able to collate them, and we think we're going to be able to answer many of these comments and or questions in tonight's presentation. But if we do not get to them, or if you have more, please go to your email and click on the Google form so you can submit more questions, and we'll do our best to follow up with a Q&A document in the very near future. But the one thing that I really just truly ask is that tonight, stay engaged, be open to new learning, and make sure that you understand this one thing. This is not a one and done. This is an ongoing conversation. Expect and accept the concept of non-closure. And we'll look forward to having tonight's conversation and more in the future. So to introduce our speakers tonight, Gabrielle and Shane, I'm going to pass the baton over to Kelly Weishar, who is our equity coordinator for the district.
Good evening. We would like to welcome Mr. Shane Wiegand and Ms. Gabrielle Brannigan to our event tonight. The presentation they will give tonight has been given hundreds of times across Monroe County to a wide variety of audiences. We are hoping you find it informative and thought-provoking. Mr. Shane Wiegand is the co-lead of the Pathstone Foundation's Anti-Racist Curriculum Project and a grade 4 teacher in Rush Henrietta Central School District. He serves on the boards of Connected Communities and City Roots Community Land Trust. He is an adjunct faculty instructor in the UMRMC Department of Neurology, where he lectures, leads workshops on anti-racism and equity. He and his wife live in the Beechwood neighborhood of Rochester. Ms. Gabrielle Brannigan earned her master's in education from the University of Rochester in 2016. She is a 7th and 8th grade social studies teacher and track coach in the West Irondequoit Central School District. We welcome both of them here tonight and express our heartfelt gratitude to them for taking the time to share their presentation with us.
Hey everybody, my name is Shane Wiegand. It's truly an honor to be here tonight sharing some of the research and work that our team has done on this project. We've been thrilled to collaborate with the Fairport Central School District and the amazing fourth grade teachers here. And we're really excited to share a story about our community that oftentimes hasn't always been told. It's a story I didn't learn growing up in Webster schools, but now is starting to be taught. And we're really excited to share a little bit about our work. But I'll let Gabrielle introduce herself too.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Brannigan. I am thrilled to be here tonight and share some local history with you.
So like Kelly said at the beginning, we are here as part of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, which I want to make clear, the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, we are hosted generously by the Pathstone Foundation. We are not officially part of the Pathstone Foundation. We are a collaboration of teachers from across Monroe County, who you can see pictured right there on the screen, who are determined and dedicated around the subject of helping kids understand the history of racist policy, of people who resisted, and how they might understand the world they currently live in, contextualize it, and if they so choose, determine how they want to be a part of making the world what they see as a more just and equitable place for everyone. When you take a look at our project, we are advised by a community advisory board with folks from all across the community who have helped direct this work, help us find an amazing crew of teachers to work with, as well as making sure that the work we're doing is something truly supported by the community, inclusive of diverse community voices, and something that truly respects the experience of folks in our community and is a starting point for helping tell this story in classrooms and in the community like we're doing here tonight. So much of our work is deeply influenced by Richard Rothstein, who you can see wrote The Color of Law. Pathstone brought him to town a few years ago, and I had the chance to sit on a panel with Richard Rothstein, who went through a bunch of this work and helped consult with us on thinking through how to tell the national story of racist housing policy right here in Rochester and how to do it with kids. But even more important are the stories of folks of color who were civil rights leaders back in the 50s and 60s and still to this day. You'll see there Dr. Walter Cooper, who was the first African American to buy a house in Henrietta. He fought against racism when it came to integration of housing, of schools, policing, so many different areas. And Dr. Alice Holloway Young was a pioneer in education, also in housing and moving into the 19th Ward and facing back. You'll see some of her story, as well as helping found Monroe Community College and being the first principal of color in all of Monroe County. We're supported not by Pathstone. Pathstone doesn't fund our project. Instead, we are funded for the next 3 years by the United Way, ESL Charitable Foundation, the Greater Rochester Health Foundation, Community Foundation, Farish, the Realtors, Paychex Bank of America, and hundreds of individuals, including parents right here in Fairport, who believe in this work and want to make sure that we help kids investigate these primary source documents and draw their own conclusions about what's happened in our community. Everything we're doing is rooted in the New York State Social Studies Framework and the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. So it's something that's safe, that's supportive, and encouraging for kids to help see themselves and understand their community and this history. You'll see a bunch of sources tonight, including from Richard Rothstein's work, the New York State Commission on Discrimination from 1958, a whole host of pictures and articles and interviews from the Democrat and Chronicle archives, the Public Library's Voices Project that interviewed civil rights leaders in the early 80s, as well as a number of interviews that myself and our team has had the chance to do with people of color who led the civil rights movement and continue to lead it here in Monroe County. I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle to talk a little bit about where we're at in this moment. I'm going to give us some history, and Gabrielle's going to close with how we help kids wrestle with these ideas and draw their own conclusions about what this story means for our community.
So before we jump into the history, I just want to give an overview of where we are right now. So if you look at these charts from the federal census, these are from the 9 greater Rochester area counties. So that would be Monroe, Genesee, Livingston, Ontario, Orleans, Seneca, Wayne, Wyoming, and Yates. It has been reported that stark disparities exist between the towns and neighborhoods in where we live, and that these disparities are based on race and ethnicity. So the Act Rochester Data Report shows that these disparities pervade all aspects of life, including homeownership, employment, life expectancy, and education. And the data report summarizes that overall, African American children are nearly 4 times more likely to experience childhood poverty than white children, while for Latino children, the likelihood is slightly more than 3 times. Looking at this census dot map from 2010, you can see the segregation in our community in a different way. So if you look all around in the surrounding suburbs in Monroe County, you see a concentration of blue dots representing white residents. When you look at the center of Monroe County, which is the city of Rochester, you see a concentration of green and brown dots and orange dots, which represent Asian, Black, and Hispanic residents. And so you'll notice that the blue dots are surrounding the city of Rochester, and the city of Rochester has very few to little blue dots. According to EdBuild, which is a former nonprofit organization that analyzed and researched school funding across the United States, the single most segregating school district border in the country, so in the entire United States, divides New York's Rochester City School District and the Penfield School District. Rochester City School District residents in that district have about a 47% poverty rate, while in the suburb of Penfield, there's only about a 5% poverty rate. Rochester is ranked 27th out of 381 US metropolitan areas when it came to segregation of Black and white students. Racial disparities can be seen, as I said, in all aspects of life. So if we look at life expectancy, a Common Ground Health Report, which is formerly the Finger Lakes Health Systems Agency, reports that a child from Pittsford 14534 zip code born today will live on average 9 years longer than a child born in Rochester's 14608 zip code. And so all of these reports and the data just go to show that there are large systemic racial disparities in our county, in our neighborhoods, and in our schools. And this can so often make us feel hopeless or make us feel guilty. And these are valid feelings when confronted with information that is new, that is shocking, and quite frankly, that is not really well known. So as James Baldwin put it, he charges us in this quote that these things cannot be changed until the story is told and until we work to remedy them. So tonight, we're not only going to highlight the story of segregation in our community, but we're also going to look at the people causing good trouble, the people who spoke up, who pushed for courage, so that we might encourage ourselves and our children to join them in the struggle for a more just and equitable future.
And so now I want to talk a little bit about these people who caused that good trouble, who when these racist policies started to begin in the 1930s, specifically around housing, they called them out. They named them for what they were and encouraged others to join them in taking civic action to change these things. Meet Howard Coles, editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper on the Red Line Clarissa Street neighborhood. Howard Coles took out his life insurance policy, cashed it in to open this black newspaper in Rochester and start pushing a platform of racial justice in Monroe County. In 1938, when he started to see what was going on with redlining in Rochester, he started to speak out about it, name it for what it was. He talked about how African Americans didn't have access to buying homes in communities like Penfield and Fairport, or Cobbs Hill, or East Avenue, or the 19th Ward, finding that there were only 2 neighborhoods that realtors would show black people homes and apartments in. And those were the 3rd, that Clarissa Street neighborhood, the 3rd Ward, Plymouth Exchange area, and the 7th Ward, that Hudson, Joseph, Clinton area of our city here in Rochester. He found that in those 2 neighborhoods, 30% of all housing units didn't have running water. And streets like Portland Avenue, half of the apartment units didn't have heat. The city took his report and did a deeper dive, bringing in the U of R, and found it was even worse than Howard Coles has found. Howard Coles kept speaking out, and today his legacy lives on with his daughter, Joan Coles, who serves on our board of directors, advisory board at the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, and helps guide this work and tell her father's story. Building on her father's work, this man who faced this racism head-on is Dr. Anthony Jordan, who knew that housing and health, much like today, are directly connected. he published this big report in the Democrat and Chronicle, finding that in Rochester, the black death rate from all causes was 50% higher than that of whites. The tuberculosis death rate among people of color in Rochester is 2.5 times that of whites and directly linked to housing conditions. And how did this happen? Well, it was something the real estate industry had already been doing when it came to racial segregation. But in 1934, the federal government got involved and codified many of these policies, helping build our suburbs, towns like Fairport and Webster, where I grew up, and helping over 35 million families have access to home ownership during this period from 1934 to 1968. So it's the wake of the Great Depression. There's a housing crisis. People are having a really hard time owning or buying a home. And so FDR, who's not from Mississippi or Florida, he's from New York State, former governor of New York State, and Senator Wagner of New York State signed into law the National Housing Act of 1934. This creates the FHA mortgage, the 30-year fixed interest rate, the very little down loan. In 1944, the GI Bill takes on this entire policy and incorporates it into helping veterans who are coming back from World War II also have access to home ownership. But this law was explicitly for white people. Written right into this law, it specifically said that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, its necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy, they say, leads to instability and a reduction in values. Going on to actually explicitly mandate that racial deed restrictions should be imposed on all land in the immediate environment of a subject location. So if you're a builder, like in Fair Acres here in Fairport, and you want to build your development, and you want federal funding to help buy the materials up front or help purchase the land up front, you need to put racial restrictive covenants barring people of color from ever living on those homes, right there in black and white. Even mandating that roadways should be constructed to separate inharmonious racial groups, which helped us get 490 and the inner loop separating downtown from those two redlined, predominantly black neighborhoods we talked about earlier. And one of the main ways this law worked was to enforce racial segregation through something called residential security, or which now we often call redlining. Neighborhoods were assessed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they assessed neighborhoods based on race and class. Green and blue neighborhoods meant best because they were 100% white, predominantly middle and upper middle class. Yellow meant declining, older homes, maybe newer immigrants to the United States. Red meant hazardous. If even one person of color lived in that neighborhood, it could get a red line rating, meaning this is a neighborhood where no federal investment should go, where banks shouldn't be investing and would not be encouraged to, and where people of color would be steered and forced to live. Those are those 3rd and 7th Ward neighborhoods, and then the Josana neighborhood kind of in the middle, which was that predominantly Italian neighborhood where Italians were often pushed into. Take a look at the Cornhill Assessor's Report from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Notice it got its red line rating because it was 75% black and 10% foreign. Notice Italian at this time did not count as white or Caucasian. Compare it to Pittsford's East Avenue Estates, which had racial covenants in every home, 0% black, 0% foreign, quadruple the income. Therefore, desirable, if you're white like my family, you could get a 30-year mortgage subsidized by the federal government, a handout allowing you to build wealth and have access to the American dream. Compare my neighborhood in the Beechwood of Rochester, 2% black, and therefore hazardous. Compare that to Kodak's Meadowbrook neighborhood in Brighton, which we'll talk more about later, 0% black, 0% foreign, deemed best. You can move there if you look like me. Meanwhile, all of our suburbs, which at the time were really small villages and farming communities where, like, the government didn't see them big enough to rate yet, officially just said, these places are green-lined. And to show you how effective this policy was, in 1960, almost 30 years after this law gets passed, Henrietta is the most integrated suburb of Rochester, with just 11 individual people of color living there, led by the Cooper family, who moved in 1958, being the first 2 people of color to own a home in the town of Henrietta. Richard Rothstein gives us some more scale for us to consider, letting us know that the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide during this period of time, and the majority of private mortgages followed these same racist policies laid out by the government. The government gave out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance during this period of time. in which over 35 million families like mine benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans, and 98% of those folks were white. So let's talk about some of the people that resisted and show you how these personal stories played out right here in our community. Stories that growing up I learned happened in the South, but didn't know happened right here in our community. Meet Alice Young, who I showed you earlier, who's been very influential on our project and helping us tell this story. Now, Dr. Young and her husband, James, here she is, she has a doctorate, her husband has this great job, they're an upper middle class family, and they want to move out of the Red Line neighborhood they're renting and buy a house with more space for their kids to play in. And so they choose the 19th ward. There's a bunch of houses for sale, but not a single real estate agent would show them a home, and not a single bank would pre-approve them a mortgage because of the color of their skin. So the Youngs reach out to Mrs. Harper Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph fortune. She had that big mansion on East Ave, and she was a member of the NAACP. And she bought them a house, sight unseen, on Millbank Street in the 19th ward. Alice has told me and also told the paper in the past about how she moved into the house in the middle of the night with just a crib and a suitcase and her husband and children because they were afraid of what they knew was going on in the neighborhood and wanted to try to ease their way in. But they were spotted, and the next morning, the Ku Klux Klan of Millbank Street struck, sending incredibly offensive messages to the Youngs, threatening to burn their house down if they didn't leave, but the Youngs refused, and for the next 17 years, they stayed in that home. And Dr. Young has asked that whenever I tell her story, that I mention the Bush family. They were the one white family on the street that stood with the Youngs against the terror of some of the neighbors and of the Klan here in Monroe County, helping them stay in that home. And Alice has asked that the next time someone tells you that was just the times, I want you to remember the Bush family who lived across the street. Now, we don't think of our community as a Klan town. We think of that as a Mississippi or a Florida, right? But take a look at East Rochester. This is where the East Rochester High School football field is today. 8,000 fully robed Klansmen birthing 3 50-foot-high flaming crosses in celebration of white supremacy right here in Monroe County. The next day, 20,000 Klansmen walked down Main Street in their robes. This is 1926, again, in Monroe County. And their presence lasted throughout the next several decades, making it difficult for people to move into some of these towns. But one of the less in-your-face things, but just as public, on thousands of deeds across Monroe County, that also helped continue to segregate this community and create the disparity we see today, is something called a racially restricted covenant. Whenever you buy a house, if you own a home, you know you have a deed, and on that deed, there are rules for how you have to use your home. Some of them are pretty basic, like where your garage can be or how far from the street, the sidewalk. But one that was popular nationally, codified by the federal government in the 30s, and especially popular in Monroe County, was a deed mandating that no person of color could legally own or occupy the home. And this summer, my students and myself, City Roots Land Trust, and Yale Law School's Environmental Protection Clinic teamed up to do a deep dive at the county clerk's office and found tens of thousands of these covenants on deeds all across Monroe County, including here in Fairport. But first, I want to talk about how this wasn't something that was done by just a few fringe folks on the side. This was something that every single member of the Monroe County Legislature, including the folks from this area, and County Manager Clarence Smith signed into all their tax foreclosed homes in Monroe County. This deed that specifically said, this was 1939 and 40, no persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or lot except if they're a domestic servant. Take a look at Fairport in the Perrington, East Rochester area. The Fair Acres neighborhood and the Forest Hill neighborhoods, almost all of those homes have these racial covenants, barring any person of color from living there. Even advertising in Fairport, a beautiful new restricted residence section, letting people know who was allowed to live there. But Kodak was involved as well. George Eastman tasked Harry Haight with forming the Kodak Realty Corporation, and ESL Bank was founded to finance this development for Kodak employees. And on the deed to every one of these Kodak homes in Meadowbrook, it said, no lot or dwelling shall be sold to or occupied by a black person. And this is a neighborhood that today is still less than 4% African American. But the neighbors in Meadowbrook, 75% of them came together this summer, and they actually changed their covenant to disavow the racist statement and add an anti-racist statement of welcome and of equity to try to promote a change that they want to see in their neighborhood. This is something, though, that all across the community people did. Bishop John Francis O'Hearn agreed to these racial covenants on Catholic churches in our community, like St. James Church in Irondequoit, school districts like in Gates, Thomas Edison School number 4, now Hope Hall, saying this lot should not be used by members of any race, not of the Caucasian. De jure school segregation, those are the school board members' signatures right there on the deed. All throughout Pittsford, like in East Avenue Estates by Oak Hill, over 2,000 covenants in northwest Irondequoit, that Somerville, Rogers Estates, that whole area by the zoo. And one of those homes was bought, and the covenant was agreed to by Walter Wegman, founder of Wegman's Food Markets, who, when he went to sell the home, the deed had expired, and he re-upped that racial covenant to make it so that that home stayed a whites-only property. All throughout Webster, notice Polish, Italian, and black people are listed. Throughout Penfield, throughout Greece, Gates, where the president of the Builders Association, Norman Huck, and Frank Drum, of the president of the Realty Association, put hundreds of these under homes by Brooklyn Country Club. The head of the Bar Association in Rochester, Early Case, did the same thing. And I know I'm doing a little bit of overkill here, right? But I want you to see that this wasn't some casual thing done by a few bad actors. This was done by the leaders of our community who had a clear vision and design for what they wanted Monroe County to look like, and to say who was welcome where. Meet Judge Reuben Davis. He was one of the people who named these things, along with Howard Coles, and fought back, and was actually successful. He later became the first black judge in Monroe County, and he describes his story like this. He says, "My wife and I were looking for a house. It's 1958. Let that date stink in, 1958. We saw a house on 135 Elmdorf Ave, a block or so west of Genesee. I'd say there were probably 4 black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee at that time, remember the Youngs, and the owner refused to sell to us because we were black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed. These houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians." Before I go on, a note about Italians, Jewish, and Polish folks. Before 1944, they were deemed not Caucasian, according to the federal government, specifically in the National Housing Act. But with the passage of the GI Bill, Polish, Jewish, and Italian folks legally became white in our country and had access to FHA and GI loans, whereas black veterans who served our country in World War II did not have that same access. Davis kept fighting back. He says, "I was active in the NAACP at the time, and a white friend bought the house, transferred it to me, and that's what we had to go through, those kinds of devious methods in order to find housing." And you can see the home that he bought. Nothnagel was the folks that sold it to him and who he had to go around to find victory in living where he wanted in Monroe County. And if you take a look at this map, you'll notice the redlining map superimposed with these black spaces. Each of those black shaded areas represent neighborhoods across Monroe County where almost every home has a racial covenant on them, barring people of color from living there. These officially were done away with in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. This is in every community in Rochester, and researchers at U of R and RIT are continuing to dig through the county clerk's archives, and we estimate there are another 20,000 of these covenants yet to be found if our estimates are right. The next thing I want to talk about, though, is what was going on in the culture in Monroe County at the time, specifically in schools all across Monroe County, that speaks to the statement of welcome that people wanted for these racist housing policies and segregation, and the messages they were teaching their kids explicitly about it. This is something called a blackface minstrel show. Every blackface minstrel show almost always had characters in full blackface with painted on red lips. Main characters, always a Jim Crow, Zip, C-O-O-N, a Jim Dandy character. You had a Mr. Sambo and a Mr. Bones character that danced and sang incredibly racist songs, spreading a message of hate and contempt for people of color, and a clear message of how their children and how the community should view who counted and who was welcome in their town. This is something that happened in every town and almost every school in Monroe County, and was proudly published in local papers like the Democrat and Chronicle and the local papers in the towns. This is the front page of the Honeyway Fall Times in 1960. 52 Cub Scouts in blackface on stage at Honeyway Falls Elementary School. But Kodak and GM, they participated too, having these minstrel shows where executives would blacken their faces and perform these shows for the employees, proudly publishing them in their magazines. Folks all across our community did this. The Catholic Church in Pittsford had their annual show at the Pittsford Town Hall. Almost every school in RCSD had these blackface shows, and the D&C would publish puff pieces like this one. Aquinas, Brighton High School's annual Licorice Lights performance, Allendale, Harley would do yellowface performances. You can see Newark, RIT had an annual show. Every single town put these on, including the fire department right here in Fairport. But of course, as you've seen throughout this presentation, people of color have always chosen to live out those words of James Baldwin, name these issues, face them head on, and call for change and justice. The Reverend Primo of the NAACP and Flora Harris wrote letters to every school district in Monroe County and published letters to the editor of the DNC, condemning these blackface minstrel shows, saying they must be banned from public and private schools, churches, and public buildings. To do otherwise, they say, will cripple permanently the attitudes of white youth involved in these community-accepted shows towards all of the dark-skinned people of this world. This is 1961. These shows are a part of the culture at this time across our county. How many of these folks are still alive and learned these stories? And yet it wasn't until I stumbled across this that I knew that this was happening. I want to note, though, this isn't something we show fourth graders. This is something that we show 12th grade students and students in college and teachers to understand the reason we need to do some of this work in our community. This is pretty upsetting, I think, for a fourth grader to see some of this, but fourth graders were in these blackface shows across our county, and it's important context as we look at this work. But it's also important not just to hear people's stories, individual stories, not just to look at policies, but to look at hard data from the time. And in 1958, because of activists of color like Cooper and Coles and Young, Governor Harriman responded with a commission, the New York State Commission on Discrimination, in 1958. That gives us some specifics about how these racist housing policies directly impacted and shaped Monroe County, and still to this day. Finding that in the 50s, 80% of all black folks lived in just those two red line neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th wards, which you can see outlined here on the screen. In these neighborhoods, it found that more than 1,600 units had no bath or a shared bath, and in more than 2,000 units, there was one person living in each room. This incredible overcrowding, dilapidated housing conditions caused by disinvestment in the Federal National Housing Act led people like Connie Mitchell to carry on the legacy of Susan B. Anthony and fight for justice. Connie Mitchell was the first woman to be elected to government in Monroe County, as well as the first person of color, and she ran to fight redlining. She describes why we ran, saying we were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house on Gregg Street, the agent told us, I can't show you houses west of Jefferson. They're not open to black people. So we were confined from Jefferson back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side of the city. The report documents that almost 20 years after Coles had called out the issues with lack of access to clean, running water, that these neighborhoods, 30% of all units, still did not have running water. Not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any black person in any suburb, including the town of Fairport and Perrington. Only 7 families, 57 families actually, that's a typo, were able to own a home outside of the 3rd and 7th wards, including the Wells, who joined the Coopers and the Lees and Henrietta. But many folks faced quite a bit of violence when they did make their way in. Some people of color who had a little bit more means and access, like the Biases, they tried to change some of these things. Dr. Thomas and Ermina Bias, they bought a house in 1964 in West Irondequoit. After moving in, quite quickly after, through their living room window, they had rocks thrown through their window by the Klan. They were threatened. They were terrified. They sold their house, and they joined the Coopers and Lees in solidarity out in Henrietta, but not before having to sue the developer at their home on Gatehouse Trail, who wouldn't sell them the home explicitly because of the color of their skin. They won, and that's where they lived for a number of years. The Tullivers in Brighton, in 1960, they tried to buy their house in Verena Drive, and almost the entire neighborhood pooled their money together and tried to buy the house out from under them at the bank. They were successful until the Tullivers joined the NAACP and successfully sued for the right to live in that home that they had bought. The Stubbses in Greece, she got smart. She decided to have a white family who had the same job as her, and in her family, go out at separate times to a neighborhood in Greece on Long Pond Road, to the same developer and agents. And the white family was shown several homes, and the Stubbses were told, nothing's available. Sorry, you're going to have to look elsewhere. They sued and also won the right to live in their home. And we don't see these stories really until the 60s. And the late 60s, this starts happening more and more and more. Meanwhile, builders like the Hucks, the Drums, the Tosches, the Farishes were making hundreds of millions of dollars that were subsidized by the federal government in these whites-only housing policies, allowing suburban towns like Pittsford and Fairport to explode in population, allowing families like mine who moved to Greece, whose home quadrupled exponentially in value, to build incredible amounts of generational wealth through home equity. Towns like Pittsford jumped from 1950 to 70 from 9,000 to 25,000 residents, and the town of Pittsford itself acknowledges in their 2017 report that this was a direct result of federal housing policies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Next, urban renewal. These red line neighborhoods, there's not running water, the houses are starting to fall apart because landlords can't invest in these properties. And so instead of fixing the homes, instead of doing some type of equitable housing or trying to fight the segregation in our community, the city of Rochester took a grant for $35 million to do urban renewal, which activists of color like Howard Coles referred to as black folk removal. Black neighborhoods like Clarissa Street that were thriving neighborhoods that tried to fight back against these segregation issues through things like jazz at the Python Club or Shep's Paradise. There was even a black-owned grocery store in the Clarissa Street neighborhood. All of this was decimated by the construction of 590 and the removal of over 886 families from the 3rd Ward and 850 families from the 7th Ward, resulting in incredible displacement. But where did these folks have to go? They couldn't move to the suburbs. They still legally really weren't allowed. So what they did is they ended up packing in to streets like Jefferson Avenue or streets like Hudson Avenue on the edges of these red line neighborhoods, causing even more problems and more issues in the community because we wouldn't address the root cause of those problems. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about education. You look at that picture on the left. We all know this picture. Elizabeth Eckford, the Little Rock Nine after Brown versus Board in 1957, facing racial terror for just trying to go to school in an integrated setting. Fast forward over 10 years later, Charlotte High School was forced to integrate here in Rochester, New York, and a similar mob of angry white parents throwing rocks, hurling racial epithets, just horrific instances that we could go into. The DNC described how tension developed at Charlotte after 3 black girls were cut by flying glass on a bus that was stoned from the white parents protesting school integration. So we have some wounds in our community that have yet to heal and have resulted in incredible segregation that follows that same pattern created by the federal government from redlining in the past. Problems that when you look at the population of who lives where today, and when you see that racial disparity in home ownership, in health, and in all these different things, you can see we have work to do. We have to face this history head on and start to understand how we move forward. And we're not here to tell you how we have to move forward, but how we can help kids decide what they think they should do about it. And I'll turn it over to Gabrielle to talk more about it.
Thanks, Shane. So the project that we've designed for students in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade really focuses on allowing students access to this local history through a variety of activities that are student-led, through a variety of sources, as well as individual work, group work, and whole class discussions. And so the protocol that we've developed and the lesson that we've designed is not prescribed. If you look at it, it does say over the course of 5 days, but as with most lessons, teachers have autonomy with how they use it and how it fits into their time schedule. Students would start with an introduction, there would be vocab overview, there would be SNL and culturally responsive circles and discussions, and then students would be introduced very slowly to information, starting with a mystery source, moving to a common source, and then looking at something called jigsaw sources. And all of these things build on each other and get progressively more informational as students move through the project and the lesson. One of the main parts of the lesson requires students to take on different roles that we've designed as superheroes. And so as you can see here, we have Captain Context, Lady E, the Credible Hulk, and the Connector. And so students with a lot of the history that Shane has just gone through would take various sources that have been designed and have been vetted by teachers at various grade levels that will be developmentally appropriate for students, will grapple with the history that we've just seen. They will grapple with these sources. They will look at them. They will analyze them through the context. And what they're looking for is whether or not the sources that they have are reliable. Are they authentic? What is the purpose of this source? What might the bias in this source be? Are they connected to other things? What's the main idea? And what's the context? How does this fit into the larger scope of American history and Rochester history? Every part of the project that we've designed and of this lesson aligns with the New York State Social Emotional Learning benchmarks, as well as the New York State Social Studies framework, as Shane mentioned earlier. These projects and the lessons and the materials are all designed to help students learn how to honor and identify what they and their peers may be experiencing, as well as practice positive interactions with their classmates, with their teachers, throughout their day, right? Hopefully expanding beyond the classroom. And so as Shane mentioned earlier, all of these things stem from this graphic from the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. And this project is really centered on students and allowing students to investigate on their own, to pose questions on their own, and to make connections to their communities and hopefully feel a stronger connection to our local history.
I want to close with a story of 3 girls. I want to close this story with a story. I didn't turn on my microphone, my apologies. With the story of 3 girls in my classroom who, after learning this history several years ago in an earlier version of this project, one of the girls, who's a student of color, came up to me afterwards and she said, I think that there's a problem with racism in our school. We don't have any black teachers. And I said, that's true. And she said, that's systemic racism. And I said, I think according to some of the definitions in our conversation, I think you could really make an argument for that. Tell me why you think it. And she started talking about it, how she felt it wasn't fair that she wouldn't have a teacher who looked like her. And then I said, well, what do you want to do about it? And she said, we have to talk to the principal, and we got to do it today. And I was like, well, we could do that today. But what did Connie Mitchell do? What did Howard Coles do? What did Dr. Cooper do? Can we learn from their stories to help you accomplish your goal? And again, this was her goal. And she said, oh yeah, let's get friends involved and let's make sure we know what we're going to do. And I was like, that sounds like a great idea before we meet with the principal. And so we met together, we researched, we found we had 550 white teachers in Henrietta and 11 black. We did the math, so we got some math in there, and found that the chance of them having a teacher who looked like them was almost impossible by the time they graduated. It would take a small miracle. So they felt like they had a fair argument, they felt like they had a case, and we got parent permission, and we met with the principal, and this is all the girls. They tell them their story. They showed them their slides and their math and what they had learned. And the principal was like, oh man. So we talked to the assistant superintendent of instruction. We talked to another assistant superintendent. The girls shared with the school board. And then our district changed some of its hiring policy and started actively recruiting teachers of color to follow what these girls who participated in trying to make what they saw as something better in their school. This isn't part of the curriculum. This wasn't something that they were told to do, but they were inspired. They saw people who looked like them. They saw people who were different from them. They saw them working together and trying to create a community that they saw themselves in, that they wanted to be a part of. And they asked for permission, they learned from those examples, and they made a change. And imagine what kids could do if we help them understand, one, this history, give them language to explore, to think about, and decide how they want to use, to accept or to not accept, and to make the changes that they want to see to build what they consider to be a just and equitable community. As teachers, it's our job to help kids look at primary sources, use those superheroes, and understand this moment we're in, and recognize that the reason we go to school is to be citizens, to participate, to understand our world, and to shape it to the ways that we see. And that's what we want to empower kids to do. So thank you so much for having us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Brett.
Shane Wiegand and Gabrielle Brannigan, thank you so much for your powerful presentation. As a former social studies teacher, the ideas that you shared resonate in that it prompts students, it connects students to local community, and I couldn't help myself, reflect on, my own autobiographical references and looking at those pictures and knowing where those places are. It adds a level of connection to it, and I think that connection is critically important to get students to critically think, to engage with each other. And I'm going to transition this next part of the presentation over to Ellen Reed and segue into our curriculum. I know that Gabrielle started talking a little bit about the curricular components, and I think that is why we're here, but we're going to go a little bit deeper now, and I have the pleasure to introduce Ellen Reed, our Director of Humanities, who's going to walk you through some of the work that we're doing here in Fairport. Again, one of our big rocks, the curriculum components of it.
Thanks, Brett. And thank you, Gabrielle and Shane, for that presentation. I'm going to take some time and just go through some of the work that we have been doing. And I think what's key is when we, and Brett mentioned this, we're talking about work that we've been doing over a long period of time in terms of curriculum and standards work. I'm going to focus on the humanities aspect of this work, which is primarily English language arts and social studies. But I think that it's critical to think in the terms of standards-based and content-rich, because the content is the vehicle. The content is how we actually move standards forward. And so I think some of what Shane and Gabrielle shared is exactly that. It's that content that then gets to our standards. So I'll start with, and actually, it's interesting, we already saw through the presentation, the large overarching standards that we connect with through this work are the culturally responsive and sustaining education framework, which Shane and Gabrielle showed in those trees. And this is something, again, as New York State educators, as a district, we're obligated to use these standards as part of our curricular work. And I think as you see in the 4 areas that are most important in this work, the keys, the welcoming and affirming environment, the high expectations and rigorous instruction, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, the inclusive curriculum and assessment, and ongoing professional learning and support. These are key, and truthfully, these ideas are overarching in all of our curricular areas, not just the humanities. This is a framework that's critically important in all of our curricular areas. I'm here to focus on the humanities pieces. So I also want to highlight, when you take a look at key points that come from our humanities ELA curriculum, and if you take a look at just some of the key areas, remember, just pieces of the larger context of English language arts, these are standards that are critical for school districts. We are obligated to actually work through and actually have culturally responsive texts, and texts that should reflect global and diverse variety of authors and time periods and genres. So the work that we've been doing is connected to these standards. And so I share first some of the work that we've been doing in English language arts. And I start actually with, for me, one of the most important concepts is that the most culturally responsive thing that we can do as a school district is to make sure that students can actually engage in high expectations and rigorous instruction. The most important thing we can do is to make sure that our students can read and write and be critical thinkers. And so beyond the text, beyond picking, the particular unit or a particular book to use, it is critically important for us as a school district to make sure that we have high expectations connected to making sure that students can read and write. I focus here on our work at the primary level, just because I think it is one of the most important things that we can do. And so we have been working over the past few years to make sure that at the primary level, that we are actually engaging in the science of reading work that has become very important as really across, not just New York State, but across the country. And to make sure that our teachers are trained and that students are really getting that foundational work that they need in order to be able to be solid readers and writers. We're dabbling a little bit into the writing revolution as well. I put that up there as a reference. We're just getting into some of this work, but I can't emphasize enough that I think this is, for me, some of the most important work that we're doing to really get us on that road. We want to make sure that as students grow and as students, as Brett mentioned in the beginning when we're talking about our district initiatives or our district goals, we want the students to end up, when they graduate, as a student who can critically think and who can engage in this kind of work. And it starts here. It starts really at the most primary level. In addition to that, of course, we want to talk about the content. So when we take a look at again, one of the pieces of the work that we've just started this summer was to create a collection of read-alouds at the elementary level, K-5. that have lessons and class discussion prompts that go with them. Each grade level has 3 texts that they are going to engage in throughout the school year. And they run the gamut of identity, race discussions, and also the idea of actually being activists. Some of what I think, again, Shane and Gabrielle were talking about were very much a part of this work as well. I think what's critically important here is to realize all developmentally appropriate books that are, of course, connected to what's important at each grade level, and also that come with support for teachers so that they can engage in these discussions with our students. In addition, at the 6th through 8th level in ELA, we've just started to add to our canon. If you think back to the slide that I shared earlier, connected to ELA, we are looking at adding to our culturally responsive texts, in addition to, of course, really analyzing the text that we already have. And so that's a work in progress. We're really just starting that work. And so as we look through 6 through 8, there's our collections of books that we're doing at each level. And again, at the high school level as well, again, work that we've really just started to kind of scratch the surface of. Again, all standards-based, all with the connection to what we are expected to do as a district across that standards work. In addition, social studies is a part of the humanities, of course. And so this is very connected to the presentation that we just saw. And Shane and Gabrielle referenced the K-12 social studies framework. And I think, again, what's key, and I've just highlighted some of the most important things, when you're looking across the themes at a glance, the things that as a district we are required to actually include in our curriculum work, you're looking at interaction of cultures, you're looking at making sure that there are global connections and exchanges, civic ideals and practices. So all of the curriculum work that we're doing is connected to this framework. And so we've already talked through the grade 4 curriculum. We are connecting, and Shane has done a fantastic job coming and working with our 4th grade teachers and really being supportive with them and walking through the curriculum. I think it's important to realize that Shane's presentation, when he does to an adult, and he did a great job tonight making sure that it was clear, it doesn't look exactly that way in a 4th grade classroom. The concepts are there, but everything is connected to New York State standards, the culturally responsive standards, and is done in a way that actually requires students to do some really quality, important critical thinking. In addition to that, we also mentioned, so I think Shane and Gabrielle mentioned that there are projects that are happening through Petstone at 4th and then other grade levels. We are focusing with Shane on that 4th grade curriculum. And then, as Brett mentioned, we are also connected to the University of Rochester Center for Urban Education Success. So we are collaborating with that group to work on curriculum project at the 8th, 11th, and 12th grade level. The reason those are the grade levels, so if you're wondering, well, why not other grade levels? These are the grade levels that study New York or U.S. history, and so it makes sense that these are the places where we actually do this work. And so this is a work in progress. We are continuing to collaborate with this group and should be working on actually doing some of the work in our classrooms in the spring. The teachers are still working through this. And so as Shane had mentioned, both projects have teachers from across different school districts who are collaborating together and using those standards to actually create this work that will be used in our classroom. And I think one of the most important things, I'm gonna throw this over to Kelly for a moment, because I think all of this curriculum work is wonderful, but I think it's critical that any of this work can only be done in classrooms where we have really created affirming environments and relationships with students. And so Kelly's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like for us as a district and some of the professional development pieces as well.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm just going to touch briefly on the last 2 parts. Ellen reviewed, if you're looking at that New York State Culturally Responsive and Sustaining Education Framework, Ellen talked a lot about the rigorous instruction as well as the culturally responsive texts. So I'm going to just touch on the last 2 just to balance out how we're implementing both the New York State Culturally Responsive Sustaining Framework as well as the other standards. Welcoming and affirming environments. We work closely with partners of restorative initiatives, also known as PERI, in our community, and we're doing wide-scale training on restorative practices and community circles. And the whole design of this is that we must get to know our students well and build relationships with them. And this is done through, again, restorative practices is a methodology for this. Community building circles, a way to structure and support meaningful conversations, a way to repair harm while maintaining relationships, and they're inclusive and equitable by nature. So again, this is an important part of this work is to, intentionally create those welcoming and affirming environments. And just to touch on the last part, and this has been talked about through the entire conversation, is that to support the implementation of these New York State standards, both in areas like English language arts, social studies, and with the responsive framework, we need to support teachers in this work. We have done work on our Superintendent's Day, as well as work during faculty meetings on how to use materials and be culturally responsive. There's been ongoing work throughout with administrators and Board of Education, summer curriculum writing and training in the new units, as Ellen mentioned, working directly with Shane to train our teachers, ongoing coaching and classroom support, as well as a whole array of professional learning sessions, book studies. We have a program called SEED for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, and again, continuation of the training and restorative practices. So again, all this is supported with an intentional work with teachers as we utilize these new materials and the culturally responsive sustaining framework.
That concludes our presentation for this evening. I'd like to thank all of our presentations once again. Shane Wiegand and Gabrielle Brannigan. We appreciate the insights that you shared and the history that lots of us don't know about. I was a social studies teacher, like I have said, and those are pieces that I wish I knew when I was in the classroom, because it would have definitely enhanced the level of dialogue and connections that we always try to create. To Ellen Reed and to Kelly Weishart, thank you so much for speaking to how this is relating in a curricular sense and from our professional development and our commitment to our work and imperative here in Fairport. Please stay engaged, be open to new learning, and continue to expect us to invite community members, staff, and students alike, and special presenters to foster conversation, deep dialogue, so we can continue to move forward, be better, foster critical thinking, and making sure that we do the very best for our students and greater community. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who joined us here this evening on YouTube Live, and we look forward to visiting with you all in the very near future. Stay well.